No, I'm not a writer.
Okay.
For those who
7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You'll never have the sacred stone.
Oh, this is crazy, mother.
So cool, welcome to episode 2 of the real-time web series. This time we've got Askew One joining us, and we're just going to kick straight into it. First question we've got is, how did you get involved in graffiti, and how did you become internationally known?
That's pretty funny. I got into graffiti because it was more or less something that everybody in my area did when I was growing up. Like, I sort of feel like at that point, like, through the late 80s and early 90s, it was just kind of synonymous with life in my neighborhood. I feel like definitely in the 90s, every kid had a tag name, like whether they actually wrote or not, you know, like even if they were just the person that drove the other people around and they get their name hit up in a roll call or whatever, it was like everybody had a tag. As far as getting like internationally known, more or less, man, just embrace the internet. We live in an isolated place, far away from everyone. We live in the bottom of the South Pacific Ocean. You know, not part of a larger continent. You know, wasn't it in one of the actual epicenters of graffiti? You know, so getting known was like something that was only going to happen through a technology like the internet. You know, putting my photos out there, networking and building with people.
But traveling was kind of important too, wasn't it? I mean, I feel like that's kind of quite pivotal to not just you meeting people, but perhaps influencing your styles in some way.
Well, initially, I didn't really think I was going to get to travel. Like, so I came up with an idea to bring like the artist I admired here instead. And that way I felt like more of my friends got to benefit from it too, and other people in the scene. So, 2000 I started doing that Disrupt the System event in Altier Square in the city. And the first artist I reached out to was Lumit from Germany, who I think right at that time was a guy that was sort of pushing a lot of boundaries and doing a lot of really cutting edge stuff. And, was definitely a hero of mine. So I reached out to him, and fortunately he was really familiar with New Zealand already. He had travelled here a couple of times. Him and Chintz had been here in the early 90s, and they'd done a lot of stuff. So when I extended an invitation to him, like he was willing to come, and kind of he opened a lot of doors for me, truthfully. Like, he started to do a lot of the introductions to people in Germany and stuff. Like, so I met other people like Dime and Cantu, Tarsik, Kodiak, like all these other people kind of through him. And then that kind of enabled me, when I travelled, to actually go over and kind of link with people that were really at the top of their game at that time. And that's why I was going to Europe first, like before I was travelling to the US or other places. So travelling definitely played a part. But for me, the most formative stuff actually happened when I invited people here, and I think that you can see that impact on our whole scene.
Fantastic. And how long have you been doing graph for now?
I started really dabbling with graffiti like in the kind of early 90s, like 91, 92. 91 was like when I first got a tag. There was a kid in my class, he wrote Bonus. He's a year older than me. He's from a crew called KOA. Yeah, he played a big part in it actually, because I didn't really do much in 92. Like, I had sort of a little tag name, and I was drawing around, I was catching little tags around the area. But when I got to high school in 93, like him and this other kid Bart were like literally the most famous guys in the city. And they were so young, man, like they were 14-year-old kids. And that was really inspiring. Like, actually, like, we kind of weren't like kind of cool or street enough to kind of roll with them by that stage. Like, like I was a little bit of a herb, so I was like, me and my little friends were off to the side, kind of looking up to them and trying to kind of be like them in a way. And my friend Dylan, he was like the first person to kind of start coming around like late at night, tap on my window and be like, let's sneak out and go down to the Morningside train station and catch some tags or whatever. And we're just kind of working it out. Another guy that was really important for me is Vance from RTR crew, because he was a couple of years older than me at school, and he was actually aspiring to do like pieces pretty early on, especially once we met Icon. He was a real motivator. He was a person that kind of really like pushed us to step it up. I mean, he's the first person to turn up at my house. Maybe it was like 94 or 95 or something, and he had like, a shitload of paint in his car. It was like, come on, man, let's go and try and do something decent, so I mean, before that point, I was just a tagger.
What would you say the importance of straights are in the New Zealand graffiti scene? Because I guess during the 90s and even into the early 2000s, that was quite pivotal to the scene in many ways.
Oh, I think that the whole kind of straights thing, like Auckland kind of like, straights tagging is still, you can see it in a lot of our pieces still today, even the more evolved work. I mean, my hand style is like completely informed by that. I mean, really, I was influenced like from that era. Like, that was the only type of tagging I really saw. I saw a little bit of late 80s stuff, like kind of flat top sort of style, like TCG style tags and stuff. But like for the most part, like the 90s for me was just about straights and big roll calls, top to bottom roll calls on fences. If you drove down like Sandringham Road or Dominion Road or something, I mean, those main arterial routes heading from the city to kind of southwest were, super bombed, and that was what I saw all the time. Yeah, like, I mean, because I think, like, especially for me, the most formative time for me really was sort of around 95, and seeing people like Riot and Fury, Rave, Remix, like all those sort of tags. And Fury particularly was somebody that really stood out because he was like a straights tagger that evolved, and so he did like like flared kind of fat cap tags. He used nicer cans. He had like, Tuxin and Tana and stuff. Before that we were all just using spray coats and DHT, things like that. People were just doing stock cap kind of tags. But he was like the first guy I saw really kind of bring a bit of flair to it, and that really caught on, man. Like, I feel like that was like so influential. Like, I feel like after that, that's what everybody wanted to do. Like kind of real flared, nice kind of straight tags, always leaning to the right. Real menacing looking, that's the Auckland aesthetic.
When did the fat cap come about? Because I feel like for a while people were using New Yorks and people were using pink dots, and then people started using Astros, and I think that was quite pivotal too.
Yeah, well, I mean, for us back in the day, I mean, a fat cat was like actually kind of a rare thing to get our hands on. I mean, like literally, like I think like the Tucson and Tana cans, like some of them had these kind of like soft caps on them. I don't even know how to really describe them, but they were kind of like close to a New York, but maybe slightly bigger. And you know, when people started tagging with those, I mean, it was kind of like revolutionary for us, you know, because like I said before that, everything was just like done with the cap that came on the can. But yeah, I mean, as far as like where piecing is kind of concerned and kind of the evolution of caps, I would say, like for me, it was like a big thing when I went to Europe one year, and I spent a bit of time floating around, and I hung out with like, you know, Atom and Smash, and then we all went over to Brighton at one point, and it was the first time I met like Revoke and Rhyme, and I saw everybody was like outlining with New York fat cats, you know, like they're doing the whole pieces like kind of like with fat cat. And to me that was kind of like full on, because like in New Zealand everybody was real like into conserving their paint. Like they were so stingy, people were painting these tiny ass pieces and like using grey dots to outline and stuff like that. And you know, it was kind of like, it made me realize kind of how whack it was, like, you know, that we were never going to be like really world class unless we were kind of like brave and treated our paint like we didn't care about it, like didn't care about wastage or anything, just like blast it out, go as big as you can, like. And from that point there was no looking back, you know. I came home and I was outlining with a New York, and I can't remember who it was, but somebody was like, oh, you're crazy, like outlining with a New York. And then afterwards I thought, like what if I just outline with a pink dot now, you know, like. And I really liked the way it looked, you know, it looked awesome, like, you know. And then I don't know, at some point it just got bigger and bigger and bigger with the cats, to the point where I was using an Astro for everything, like fill, outline, for my skinny lines, for my fat lines, like everything, like never really like changing the cap, just using one cap for the whole piece. And kind of what I got real into about it was like using a brush, you know, like if you use a really like a real decent kind of brush, like, you know, you can achieve a lot of flow and you know, a lot of different effects with just one brush, you know. It's all about how you use it. And I started to adopt that mentality to like how I use a spray can too with Astro Cat. You know, if I wanted a line that was really flared out but then came down to a sharp point, I could achieve that, and I didn't need to contrive it or build that with a skinnier cap to emulate that look. Yeah, I mean, particularly because I started to get really active during that time with like pieces more in like riskier spots. I needed to be really effective with my time, and that enabled me to be.
Nice one. And we've got one question that asks, back in the day, maybe perhaps in the early, the late 90s or early 2000s, how did you get yourself all your cans?
Yeah, well, like, so when I was really like getting into graffiti in a big way, we didn't have like a lot of these kind of brands that we have today, like graffiti specific brands. Like we had a lot of like, you know, just what was accessible from the hardware store, and they really did charge a lot of money for them, considering they were very subpar products. Like some people would be familiar with like Plasticoat. Like Plasticoat, like pretty much like an Auckland staple during that time. And the thing about it was it had a really shitty valve system, so it used to kind of stop and start at the start of a line. So you get a broken line for the first like kind of, you know, sort of, you know, 0.3 of a second, you know, like, but it would always fuck up your shit. Like you had to really like think hard about how to work around and kind of adapt your style to work with that. But it was perfectly good paint for fills and everything. I mean, most of it covered. Yeah, like I was really fortunate in the sense that I learned how to rack. And I wasn't really like a great racker, man. Like anyone who knows me knows I'm like, I always sort of felt guilty about stealing, you know, but I just felt like it was a necessary evil, so I had to do it. And I would have never ever been like able to get as much paint as I got had I not been, you know, sort of partners with some people that were really good at racking. You know, Icon was an incredible racker because he looked like a police officer, so no one ever looked at him like twice. You know, these two like polite white kids walk into your store well dressed, you know, and you know, we'd be filling up bags or doing trolley walkouts, or, you know, at least walking up with, you know, 6 to 8 cans on our person at a time. And I remember we used to, I mean, one of my most proudest moments, like it was a real defining moment when I was about like 19 or 20, was we were driving down the road and we seen Aaron B, like who was, you know, to us just like a total legend from Death Crew. And we pulled over and offered him a ride, but then in reality we could barely fit him in the back of the car because we'd stolen so much paint, and he was like lying sideways across the seat just looking at the sea of spray cans, and he was just like, you guys are fucking crazy, man. And we used to sell, you know, we used to supply a lot of like the inner city kids with their paint, like kids that weren't racking so hard at that time or didn't have a car or whatever. So Gasp and Sands and Deus and all these RSC kids used to come around to our old place and buy paint from us, mostly from Icon, because he was such a way better racker than me that he would like always get twice as much, and I'd still want to kind of hold on to my paint a little bit. So yeah.
In terms of you know, in the past, you were saying just then, you know, you used to rack paint and provide paint for other riders, but I'm also aware that currently you are sponsored, actually. So could you give us a little bit of a lowdown of how that happened and what that actually means?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, nowadays I think a lot of kids really aspire to be sponsored from the get, which is a really funny thing. I guess it's a similar scenario to like, you know, professional skateboarding or something. But, you know, that was never an aspiration of mine. It was not even something I even dreamed was possible. You know, the way I did it was, you know, for the first few years I racked. And then I got to a point where I actually did build up a kind of commercial business. I used to have a company called Disruptive with PS5 and another business partner, Deirdre. And we ran a gallery and published a magazine and used to do commercial mural work, which was one of the most informative yet soul-destroying experiences in my life, and so it taught me a lot about what I don't like doing in this world. But during that time, one of the perks was overquoting on paint on every job, and then always having an excess of paint to work with. And that was kind of my hustle right through until about 2006, I'd say, when we wound things up. And it was around that time that I first met Heath and Levi from Ironlac. I was introduced to them through Serum, and Serum really, from Melbourne, really pushed for me to get sponsored. And it was a bit of a game changer for me, man, like, to be honest. I mean, you know, they were a young company, and everybody knows, it's well documented and well known that they've gone through some real serious struggles, you know, like developing that product. But the beauty of working with them is that they're like, you know, they're not a subsidiary of a larger paint company. You know, they don't have that support network. It's literally just like graffiti writers that decide to make paint and worked everything out themselves. And, you know, they've been through so many trials and errors, but I think the thing that's really amazing about them is, you know, that they're really real earnest, and, you know, and real, you know, like, you know, I know where they're at, you know what I mean? It's relatable, you know, and that's why I stuck by them. And shit, you know, I wouldn't be in the position I'm in now had I not been given that paint, you know, like, suddenly it was possible for me to paint 4 times bigger than anyone else, 4 times as often, you know. And I did, you know, I really, you know, I took the ball and ran with it.
Fantastic. And I guess, you know, while we're on the topic of kind of disruptive, one of our questions is Disruptive Magazine. What was the inspiration behind that, and why did it end? And is there any plans to bring it back?
There's no plans to bring it back. I mean, I sort of just feel like the graffiti magazine format kind of isn't really relevant today, you know. You know, if I was to do something, yeah, if I was to create something now in the realm of publishing, it would be something a bit more substantial and a bit more long-standing and culturally relevant, like a reference point for the future, you know. You know, graffiti magazines, I mean, look, just to understand me and why I've done anything, like, I just come from this place where there was nothing, bro. You know, there was nobody else doing anything. Nobody was going to take the initiative to kick anything off, you know, and it was just like, I just sat there seeing all these things overseas that I wish we had, and knowing that nobody was going to bother to do it, so I would just do it, you know. And that's you know, that came with a lot of sacrifice, man. Like, making that magazine was super hard, like harder than people would realize. You know, it was really hard to sell advertising. Had to learn how to, like, you know, how to lay out a magazine without really any knowledge. You know, had to find the finances to get it printed, and the printing bill was just absolutely phenomenal. Had to, like, find distribution, you know, and yeah, there was a lot of stuff, like a lot of things that we were just kids working out, and it was really amazing. But ultimately, we got ripped off like a lot of money towards the end. Probably, first time we were really set to make a profit from an issue was like the 5th issue, and we pretty much got ripped off like to the equivalent value of our profit. And yeah, it was just hard to get the motivation to do it after then. You know what I mean? But I mean, I was just in Cleveland like a couple of weeks ago, and a guy told me that he had started writing after buying my magazine, over there in the US, and that was a pretty phenomenal thing. I mean, Revoke and I, that magazine was a talking point that kind of introduced us initially, like, because he'd racked a couple of issues before and he liked it, and he thought it was really cool that something was coming out from New Zealand, such an obscure place, and he reached out and said, hey, I think it's awesome that you guys are putting this together. And that's kind of what sparked off our first conversation. So, it was an important thing, but it's a time and place thing,
Reminiscing on the late 90s and early 2000s within the graffiti scene during that period. Likes, dislikes, that era?
Well, I would say that I don't dislike anything about it, because it's all what shaped me and my friends and kind of graffiti that we created. I mean, there was a lot of things that were tough. Would I take those tough things away? No. Would I take away the violence? Or the kind of fear of violence? No. Like, everybody that did graffiti back then was like super dysfunctional, man. The most dysfunctional people, and for some people it was a vehicle to kind of rise above that dysfunction, and for other people it was a way to just kind of wallow in it and get swallowed up, absorbed by it. There were so many people that graffiti was like a gateway to like real positive things in their life, and there's so many people that it just was like a little bridge between that and doing much more serious crime, and that criminal element of it was like so prevalent, like it was a huge part of it. Like, graffiti writers were such complete outsiders. We weren't gangsters, we weren't like, and we weren't artists, we were something else. There were kids that were so tough and so hard and really fought for what they did, you know what I mean? And they were like sort of so creative, yet no one in the art world would ever respect what they did or kind of understand it outside of that realm, because it was so niche. There were a lot of things that were annoying, like, I mean, the reason why a lot of people would know that Auckland writers are really fast, like a lot of us paint fast, and they don't know why, and it's because literally our stuff would get gone over so quick in the city, like the rate in which things got tagged over, because like, people have to remember, people that did pieces were a total minority versus people that were really into like doing tags, and pieces were just fair game, like no one gave a shit about that, so they'd just go straight over, or they want to have a tag through the middle of your piece so that when your piece got photographed they'd catch fame. So it was like, we'd have scenarios even at legal walls, or like trackside walls that were kind of semi-legal, because back in those days, there was a lot of grey area. Yeah, like, you'd be working on a piece all day, and then you go down to the service station to get a pie and a drink or something, and come back and there's straights right through the middle of it, and you haven't even finished it yet. So, that shit was mad annoying, but I guess it made us, like, kept us on our toes.
And I guess one of the last questions around the kind of background of that era, I love that you've kind of given a little context and framed up what that looks like comparatively to now. What do you think the motivations are and the context for people doing graffiti in New Zealand now?
I kind of hate graffiti in New Zealand now. Well, I hate it in Auckland. I actually like it in other cities way more. I think like way more people outside of Auckland are doing a better job of graffiti now. Like Auckland, to me, man, I don't know, man. The biggest shift that I saw in this scene in the graffiti sense is just that kind of those really kind of entitled, privileged, kind of like hipster kids from good neighborhoods who are just slumming it for a little while. They're at art school, and but they're on the fuck art, kind of buzz. Do graffiti for a little while it's convenient. And they do some real fucking like lame, I like what Vince calls it, like porridge in a stocking style, and fuck that. Like seriously, man, I don't care for that shit. It's real trendy. Like people like that, like all around the world it's kind of going that way, and like now, you see people, they're kind of like clowning, people from kind of, from the hood that are in graffiti. They'll clown people, who come from lower socioeconomic like backgrounds, and there's like all this kind of weird kind of like pseudo kind of racist shit that goes on in graffiti now that really fucking bugs me, and it's all these fucking spoilt rich kids. I hate that, man. Like, that's, to me, like, they're the ones that really like kind of masquerade as like keeping it real, but they're the fucking lamest people out there, like I have so much strong feelings about it. Back in the day, like, graffiti was really like, heaps of it was like about being poor and flexing, having style and flexing, despite the fact that you had nothing, like a lot of us had nothing in this world really, to go for. A lot of my friends had way less than me, man, but the one thing that they had was this, and they just did it with so much flair and finesse and style. And now it's like people get clowned for having style, and it's like, that just frustrates me to no end, man. And to be honest, man, like, yeah, ever since the Rugby World Cup, like, and the big buff in the city, like, it's really never been the same, man. It's like, I respect to the people that kept going and kept doing their thing, man, but really, like, as somebody that's kind of taken a step backwards from the scene, and I'm not active and I'm not driving it in the way that I used to, yeah, I don't know, man. I can't say I'm really proud of the scene anymore.
terms of your influences and references, could you explain a little bit about the evolution of your graffiti style and how it started and where is it now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been through a lot of different evolutions, a lot of stages. I mean, some people even like kind of mock me for that, like for following trends or something, you know. And definitely when I was young, I certainly did, and I think a lot of young people do, just kind of follow what's kind of current before they find their own voice. In the beginning, the graffiti I painted was pretty simple, man. Like I did tags, and then I did throw-ups, you know, and then my throw-up evolved into a kind of, you know, a kind of more straight, more bold kind of letter style. And then I started trying to do some tricky things, you know, and, you know, a lot of those things were kind of out of my reach and beyond my capability, you know. And, you know, for a while I focused a lot on characters. I was always working on painting portraiture and stuff like really early on. And I also, because I was so impressed by these guys from Europe who were doing big themed murals, I always wanted to be the guy to paint the background and pull everything together. And I sort of saw it as like a real selfless thing to do, is like kind of work really hard on the whole wall rather than just my piece. And obviously everyone knows I did a lot of 3D kind of stuff. And I mean, that was just the trend of those days, you know, like that was definitely me following trends. But I got to learn some stuff from the very best. And, you know, I did my best to kind of roll with that and make it my own. Whether I did or not, I don't really know. Probably not, you know. Some of it I look at and actually there's still some stuff that I learned from back in those days that are still in my pieces today. I mean, for example, you know, in about 2003 or 2004, I started like trying to focus on painting letters again, like more classic pieces. And it was after a revelation. I was looking through like all of my photo collection of everything I'd ever painted, and you know, one person just stood out all the time in the photos, which was Fat One. You know, like he had just such a clear MO. Like, you know, he wanted the biggest, baddest, boldest, you know, like the most kind of cleanest, you know, the most straight to the point graffiti on the wall, like every time, you know. He would always be front and center. He'd always stand out. And I was just like, damn, you know, like I was just looking through, and I know it's bad to compare yourself to someone. He is one of my best friends, but I just felt like shit, you know, like I've done all these murals and I've been like the selfless guy working on the backgrounds and characters and pulling all this stuff together, being the big picture guy, and actually I'm the person you can see the least. And, you know, to be honest, I was like, shit, you know, I'm gonna have to, just to appease my own ego, you know, put in some serious work and be that guy too, you know. Maybe I can be both, you know, maybe I can be the big picture guy and still get my shine. So I started really working on my pieces, you know. And shit, it was so funny because I look at pieces of mine from like late 90s and I had better letters than when I came back at it. After doing the 3D stuff, I lost a lot of form, man. I lost a lot of strength, so I had to really relearn. I wrote some other names for a while. I used to like paint under the name Vocab as well, and I started doing a lot of more like, you know, like illegal stuff again, and not just like, you know, big themed walls and things. And then, you know, eventually I just got a groove. I think 2004, 2005, I started really kind of get a lot of strength back. I started painting this very stripped back kind of take on New York graffiti. You know, I really simplified everything down and kind of built again from scratch. And then I started to elaborate. Of course, we had better paints coming into the country then as well, so I was starting to kind of be able to explore more colors. You know, was able to get a crisper kind of effect. Things covered better, you know, a lot of stuff. So suddenly, a whole lot of stuff changed, you know. I kind of went down that path for a few years. Obviously, I had a really big, like, people in Europe really impacted me. Like Cantu really impacted me a lot. But Atom, you know, from Germany, from Dortmund, you know, he's probably like the guy that was like really on my case about how to like change my letters to get more swing and kind of emotion and movement in my letters. And then even more so, I'd say, was Smash, you know, because I spent a bit of time with him, and, you know, once upon a time we were good friends, and yeah, basically he just showed me a lot of shit, you know, about how to loosen up and how to be more kind of decisive, less is more and stuff like that. Definitely that had a huge impact on me. I had a really good run with Vance. I think Vance and I were a really great pairing of painting together, you know, like doing kind of like good street and trackside spots, well, bringing a little concept to it, or a little bit of flavor, or experimenting a little bit more on the letters. You remember I went through a stage with the bold white designs that were kind of offset across the top of the letters and things. All that sort of stuff came about from that partnership. And then probably, aside from that, I mean, it's pretty clear, but the most evolution happened whilst you and I were painting together all the time, because it was just, two people with the same mindset that wanted to try and find every way possible to reorder everything that you do when you paint a piece, and kind of just challenge the status quo, And yeah, I still see bits of that in other people's work. I think that conversation was really awesome. I think it extended beyond just me and you too. I think that Seiko, Soffles, Vans, Rhyme, were all people that were really pivotal in that moment. There was just this real beautiful conversation happening. And within the space, if I look at, there's about a 4-year period. It's like 2008 to 2012. That's when we just did so much stuff. Like, just tried so many things, so many ugly pieces, so many great pieces.
Having discussed now the evolution of where your work's kind of started and where it's gone, are you still inspired by classic graffiti lettering?
Oh, I mean, I think everything decent, was done a long time ago. And everything that is done within graffiti now is just kind of a conversation around the groundwork that people did a long time ago. I mean, foundationally, basically everything was kind of done by, I mean, they say like 1972, 1973 were the years that were the most pivotal for like basically creating a framework for what is like modern graffiti today. I mean, everything that people do is just like an adaptation or a progression on an idea that some kids already did a long time ago. I will always love classic graffiti. Like, it will always evoke a feeling for me. It will always be kind of nostalgic and romantic to me, It will always excite me. But, in saying that, I'm not interested in creating that or replicating that exactly as it was done. And I'm not an Elvis impersonator. You know what I mean? I don't wear a fashion from a time. I don't paint art from a time. I don't carry myself at a certain time because that's how it was done when it was invented. I'm still trying to be a person of this time and place.
Fantastic. And I see a lot of people still actually following that route, trying to recreate some 80s looking graffiti with that particular aesthetic. Personally not a huge fan, but whatever. Another question that we've got, I mean, you've kind of briefly touched on it. You said that you had some previous kind of influences along the way in partnerships and conversations. But one of the questions we've got is, what tips or advice on style was passed on to you from an older writer that helped create the blueprint for some of the style that you have today?
Okay, well, probably the first graffiti writer that I think was super influential in the city that said anything even remotely encouraging to me was Tank. Which is funny because he was mostly a really discouraging energy for me, because he was like a total bully of the scene, but he was fucking important, like, there's no denying. He encouraged me about my throw up really early on. He was like, you need to just push that. Like, you have a good throw up, you have a good grasp of how to bomb, like, you should just sort of really roll with that for a while and get real good at that. Because he was like, you gotta, and truthfully, my throw up, the reason why he probably liked it was because pretty much was my interpretation of his throw up letters. Like, if I'm gonna be real about it. So my throw up style is like, it's very like influenced by like the Sydney graffiti of that day, of that time. Like, that's kind of what I was seeing. That was like the closest city, that was kind of like producing really classic, strong graffiti at that time. So it was aspirational for me. As far as other advice that I've had, well, I'll never forget painting next to Dime, and I painted a piece that I think really like stood up next to his and looked fine, and he turned around to me and he said, it's really great that you've worked out how to do this and get to this level, but now you have to find a way to really make it your own, and that really, really stuck with me, Like, the few times that I've been checked and told, okay, that's cool, you get it, move on, have been really powerful, you know what I mean? Like, it hurts when your hero tells you something like that, you know what I mean? But fuck, you gotta hear it, you know what I mean? I mean, I think Ryan is a really old soul in graffiti. You know, he's a very, very, very knowledgeable character. Like, he just really knows the shit inside out. He always has just loved it more than anyone else I know. And he's always had a lot of really good advice for me, you know, about ways to maybe kind of flex outside of the kind of the norm, you know, but in a way that still adheres to some sort of kind of classic look, you know, like a rhyme piece just looks like graffiti, you know, which I really like, you know. But at the same time, I mean, I really rate a lot of different artists that kind of really kind of, you know, break that completely, all those conventions too, you know. Like Zess would be somebody I'd say is like doesn't follow the rule book at all. He does in the code of how he lives graffiti, but the graffiti that he paints is so unlike anybody else's graffiti. It's so individual, like it's crazy.
I love that, and I guess everybody's got a very unique story to tell, as well as, you know, how they might influence some other writers. And I guess that probably is a good leading question to who you think are some pivotal writers in MSK. I mean, we talked about it before that, you know, all of them are in many ways, but who would perhaps be some standouts for you, and why? And why do you think they're influential to the scene?
I think MSK as a crew, the reason why it has so much strength and power is because everybody's strong individually. I mean, you have all these writers, like people of the ilk of like Zess, you know, who are just so entrenched, like who really lived it and are still living it, but just bring such a strong and kind of fierce individuality to it. I mean, yeah, Zess is kind of like one of my heroes in a lot of ways, man, as well as a very good friend. I think it goes without saying that Revoke is just an absolute powerhouse. He's just such a driver. Like, he just had such an appetite for this for so long. His stuff is so strong. I mean, I would say he's one of the most significant graffiti writers ever in history. Rhyme too, you know. I really, you know, think that I mean, it's just an amazing crew. You know what I mean? I think Steele's painting incredible pieces again right now. You know, I love what Trav's doing and how the conversation between his fine art work and his graffiti work, he's found a really, really nice, comfortable space where that works and it doesn't look like a deviation. Like, he's doing really good things. You know, fuck, it's just a crazy crew, man. Like, it blows my mind sometimes. I'm so blown away to, you know, be able to call these guys friends and peers, you know. Like, I always just feel like that little guy from New Zealand that just kind of, you know, got lucky to meet the right people and you know, to have these insights. But I love what everyone's doing as artists too. Like, I love seeing everybody's progression. I love the fact that nobody's static or so nostalgic that they're not moving. I mean, you know, when I see a Pose painting or a Reyes painting, you know, like, I mean, I'm just so blown away. I'm so moved by that. Like, it's so real because it just comes from such a legitimate place. And I love just seeing, you know, everybody's moves. I mean, you know, Revoke's fine art, you know, he's really, really somebody I think that is going to stand the test of time in that world too. You know, and I think that's an amazing thing.
Having discussed so far so many graffiti influences, what are some non-graffiti related influences that we can find in your work? I mean, I'm aware that you do, you know, studio work as well with your portraiture, but maybe tying back into the graffiti world with your lettering, do you only look at graffiti or do you look elsewhere?
I can't really separate, even though, like, I think for a lot of outsiders it's really hard to see the connection between my studio and graffiti work and my mural work. It's kind of right now looks like these three separate things that I'm up to, and I think that's really divided people's kind of attention for what I do as well. Like, I've realized that there's people that appreciate one and maybe not the other of what I do. That's definitely kind of a feedback that I've had from a lot of people, and certainly from the standpoint of somebody who's trying to live and work from their art. I guess that I haven't really created what you would call a brand. You know, like, people think so in terms of being on brand in this day and age of, like, kind of social media and utilizing the internet for marketing themselves, you know. But that's not really something I'm too concerned with. I mean, it's definitely something that's evolved to an extent, but it's not something that I'm so concerned with. It's not the point. The way that my work is in conversation with each other, maybe not like completely aesthetically apparent, but it is there, and I can kind of break it down a little bit. So I did graffiti, really consistently for over 20 years, and certainly the last decade was like really, really important time for me. And anybody that's followed my career for a long time would know that I wrote a lot, and I blogged. Like I actually used to have a blog like pretty early on. So around 2006, 2007 or something, I started writing about my thoughts. Especially in 2008, I started really piecing together a lot of things about context, about what it is to live here in the South Pacific, what it is to live in a really distinctly Pacific city in the South Pacific, what it is to live in a post-colonial society, and to be somebody that's really disconnected from their own ancestry and doesn't really know much about themselves or, anybody a generation or two ago, was always somebody drifting and looking and searching for a sense of belonging, and I found it in graffiti, but I sort of started to look at maybe the ways that the graffiti that we did and the scene that I came from, why it was different and unique to other scenes. I mean, what made Auckland different to New York? What made it different to LA? Why did it have such a connection to LA? Like, all of these sort of questions I was asking were really from the viewpoint of somebody who was writing graffiti and trying to understand why we were doing this thing that was so indigenous to another time and place and part of the world, but why did it have resonance and why did it make sense? And a lot of that, as I sort of dug deeper, came back to all of those things I mentioned before. It really was about the diaspora and the drift of Pacific peoples within the sort of greater Pacific region, that kind of flow of people and all of those things that were kind of driving and churning that. So the fact that we have a huge Samoan and Tongan population in Auckland, but there's also a huge Samoan and Tongan population in Los Angeles, and we know now that a lot of graffiti influence was coming via that population. And why was that? Well, heaps of kids were Mormon, which is just like the craziest thing ever. That Mormonism had a role in shaping graffiti in Auckland, because kids were getting sent over to go to Mormon schools or to do their mission, and they were going to California, and they were going to Utah, and they were going to Hawaii, and they were bringing all this information back, all this influence, all this pop cultural stuff, and it resonated with them because when they would go to the US, they would see people that looked so similar to themselves. There were role models that resonated with them, and obviously it's like Chinese whispers. If one guy comes back from California with a stack of photos of gang graffiti and shows all his friends and they all try to do it, obviously it's going to evolve and change, So all this stuff has been the basis for all of my art. Like, that's the very, very starting point, I take influence from my environment, I read as much as I can, and I try to understand, and this is what art's about. It's about pulling together the broader context of things, but also putting small details under a microscope and really analyzing them. And so my role as a graffiti writer, my role as an artist, as a muralist, and as a person, is really like almost like I try to think of myself more like a journalist, but I'm just communicating things with pictures more than words. But every now and then I take the time to explain things to people, and just to show people that nothing's random.
Bridging back to graffiti again, you're clearly an influential kind of figure in the graffiti scene, both in New Zealand and internationally. In terms of when other writers, whether it be New Zealand or overseas, kind of adopt some of your ideas, such as doing things like handlebars or maybe your technique using an Astro fat cap, do you think that's a positive or a negative thing for younger writers to do?
Oh, I like it. It's the same thing I said before about Chinese whispers. You know what I mean? It's like nobody's going to do a thing that another artist does for the same reason that they did it. They're not coming to the same graphic conclusion. The interesting space is when it mutates. When something mutates into something new, then it's really cool. If you just copy something, that's cool, because copying is a big part of learning and understanding how something's done in the first place. But it's about how you take that to the next level. for example, a lot of people did floating auras, you know, like auras that were like key lines that floated off from the outline. But like I can say for sure that you and I were the first people to treat them like three-dimensional objects flying in and around the shapes, you know, and it was interchangeable. Like it didn't have a rigidity of like having to like only be on the outside, because ours could go into a letter, through the whole of an O, whatever the fuck we wanted, you know what I mean? And that was cool, and I saw that catch on, you know, but I saw it catch on in a really, like a lot of people play it real safe, like they didn't really understand, like they would do a flared fat cap line around a letter or through a letter, but they didn't understand that we were thinking about these things as tangible objects in space, you know. Same thing, like I didn't like come up with like the idea to put like say for example people putting like kind of like cuts inside of the letters and everything is something that I did, like really taking out the inside of a letter was like definitely a big shift in the way I constructed a piece, and I definitely saw it catch on. I saw like lots of people do it. I don't think I was like the first, but I think I really ran with it super hard. But I think another thing that I did was putting the kind of, I guess you called it a handlebar. I didn't invent that, but what I did was I simplified it super hard with like just 2 fat cap lines. And in the New Zealand graffiti scene, you see it in everybody's letters now. Like it's super funny, you know. It's just like a flared fat cap line on the inside of the letter with a little cut, you know. I mean, that just came from doing trains, you know, and having to do something that looked kind of more technical but fast. That's all.
I love the handlebar. It's like almost a signature New Zealand thing, and it's always interesting to see young writers do it, and then they put it on the same place in each letter. It looks so horrible. Oh. One sec.
those cyclones.
Yeah.
Hey, bro.
Cool. So, in terms of the process and color, you've explained that you use Astro Fat caps, and previously the caps that you've used. What type of nozzles do you use now, and why?
It's so funny, like for the last maybe 2 or 3 years, I just about have only used, I guess they call it the Widowmaker, like the cap that comes on the Ironlat can, which heaps of people hate, but I like it. I don't know why. I mean, it goes fat enough. I can fill with it, I can outline with it, I can do half pressure with it and skinny lines, and it's fine. I've been kind of liking the green caps that come on the sugar cans as well, and I've been using them to do like more sort of controlled skinny stuff. And I tend to use like some blaster caps from time to time. I really love splatter. Like splatter is a huge part of my aesthetic. If I have the time to spend, like if I can spend a day or two on a piece, I do paint a piece that can be viewed up close, that has something that will draw you in, you know, something that's special for people to see it in person rather than see it on the internet. Some people paint for the photo. I try to paint for both.
This isn't the only cap you use, but obviously a lot of people have a fascination with an Astro cap. You know, the fact that you can flare something quite wide and get a line that's quite skinny. So why did you start using the Astro cap?
I feel like I had this conversation with Smash one time. Like we were talking about painting trains, and he was saying something about like if he has lots of time, like 45 minutes or something, he would paint like, you know, he'd fill with an Astro and then outline with a New York. But if he didn't have much time, he'd outline with a pink dot or something like that. And then I remember being like, have you ever outlined with an Astro? Was like my question, you know, because I ask all these lame questions to people too, you know. And he was like, I think at the time he said like no, like he's like, oh no, that would be way too unruly. you know. And then I thought, finally I got something I can get one up on him, so I'm gonna do it. So I did an outline on a train like with an Astro, and I got this really like kick-ass kind of line on a couple of parts, like where I just got like real flared out hollow line at the top and real sharp and aggressive, spitty and mean at the bottom. And I was like, oh yes, like that's what I want to do, you know what I mean? But I think like everybody, like I think a lot of people know, like, and I mean, once again, it's so hard to say if you're like the first to do anything or not, but I really, if I found something, I would like run with it so hard that I would definitely have some sort of a claim to things, you know what I mean? And I think like a lot of people have explored the use of these caps and how you, like the very limit of how you could flare something out and the very limit of like how drastic a point you could bring it to. Because I would say, like, you know, once again, Smash, Rhyme, yourself, Soffles, definitely, you know, all people that have really like pushed the absolute boundary of how you can use that cap to get the very most expression. Yeah, I think like that's the beauty of it. You know, it's like back in the day, if you wanted something to go from fat to skinny, you would have to kind of contrive it, you know, with a sharper cap. And here you could just do something if you're confident enough with one hit. I mean, why wouldn't you?
But in terms of the younger people now of this generation that want to learn how to use an Astro cap, what advice would you give to them for gaining kind of better can control, essentially? Because one of the, you know, questions is, how do I get super skinny lines and fat lines? And I think the Astro cap is a super versatile cap that can enable people to do that. So what advice would you give to these younger guys to master that?
Something that I learnt when I was quite young, like about 18 or 19 years old, and I learned it from Tank. I seen him spraying a can upside down for ages, letting the gas out. And he was the first person I ever saw do that. And I asked him why. And he said, well, you know, there's too much pressure in a can. You know, and he was doing a very simple kind of piece, but he was using not really the greatest paint. And it was a very high pressure paint, and he was trying to get a slower, more controlled line, and he was letting all the gas out. I guess the same thing can be achieved. You see some people keep their cans on ice, keep them cool. I mean, definitely keeping your paint in a cool place helps, you know what I mean? Because there's nothing worse than like trying to do a nice, beautiful, hollow, you know, tubular line with a fat cap, and it's a real hot day and it just comes out like a bunch of fuzz, you know? And that does happen. It happens to all of us, you know? If you watch the video, you'll probably see a lot of footage of me spraying the can upside down for a really prolonged period of time. And when I do half pressure, definitely. But I mean, I do it all the time. I feel in general there's too much pressure in spray paint for outlining. I feel like most spray cans are kind of geared more towards the filling part of the process and not really the outlining, and you always have to kind of create a workaround to get your ideal kind of settings for putting your outline on. And mine is just knocking about probably 20 or 30% of the gas out of the can.
Great. And in terms of when you're actually painting a piece, like a graffiti piece, is most of that stuff freestyle, or have you already got a sketch?
I haven't painted from a sketch in maybe like 10 years. So, I mean, I can't even remember, even if it's been maybe even longer, I don't know. It's been a long time. I mean, from the point definitely where I met like Revoke and those guys, like who just never paint from any kind of a sketch, and actually just found it ridiculous that people do. I mean, that was really pivotal for me. I mean, a lot of people said it to me, like, you don't need a sketch because the way you draw on paper and the way you draw on a wall is just like completely different because of the physicality of it, you know? I mean, painting on a wall or, you know, whatever surface you're painting on, it's like a really whole body physical experience. It's kind of like a dance. You know, drawing with your wrist is like, in your hand, it's like you're restricted by by a lot of other factors. And so the character of a drawing and the character of a painting are often different. And, you know, I also felt like when I'd sketch, I'd kind of get into this mindset where you'd spend, 4 or 5 hours doing a drawing. That becomes a complete piece of work. And then the motivation to paint that on a wall is not really there, because there's nothing creative in that. You're just replicating the creative process you've already done, So, no, I mean, I feel like you should be able to just be completely spontaneous. Graffiti is nothing without its surrounds. It gets all its power and context from its environment. If you paint graffiti that just regards the environment, That's cool. A lot of people do that. But graffiti that kind of sits in harmony and works with the environment is always stronger, in my opinion.
Well, that's an interesting question to lead into the next one, which is, you said that your graffiti pieces are freestyled, and you haven't done a sketch for 10 years, and you don't use sketches when you paint on a wall. But comparatively, you've got your large-scale murals. Are those planned, or are they freestyled?
The large-scale murals are completely the opposite. I mean, they're almost completely planned to the T. And so that's why graffiti still feels so liberating for me. Like, I love the sense of replicating something that looks like my studio work on a big wall. And you have to understand the conversation. I mean, all of the marks and patterns and strokes that go within one of those head paintings are all graffiti strokes. They're all magnified graffiti strokes. They all come from makeshift tools that are used on the street that now I've taken into the studio. And so, but then, there's no way I can create a giant mop marker, that's going to make an impactful line 5 stories high. So I have to emulate that with a roller, and bucket paint. And so it's kind of another step. It's a conversation, and aesthetically, it's really pushed my evolution too, because it's pushed the way I think about form, and deconstructing and constructing form, but all of that inspiration came from graffiti in the first place. It's just that it's impossible to go into that blind and achieve as an impactful result.
It's great that to have that balance between something that's fully planned and something that's completely freestyled, and I like that. In terms of your process, do you ever get writer's block? Back in the day, I used to hear that term, or a creative, kind of artist block, where you're kind of stuck or don't know what to do. One of the questions is how do you work through that? Because sometimes people might be stuck for ideas or techniques or colors. How do you work through that?
I mean, I get it all the time. I think it's just a natural part of the creative process. It's these little kind of blocks along the way. I mean, they're important. They're pivotal. Like, they're frustrating at the time, but that's where all the best stuff comes from. So, to impart some advice onto people, how do you get through it? You get through it by doing. Just constantly doing. Like, I think the weirdest thing mentality that I got from doing graffiti was one of feeling like everything I do has to be a masterpiece. Everything has to be like a level up from the last thing that I did, and it has to be like an amazing finished and realized piece of work. But as a studio artist, you learn that that's really unhealthy. The way that you get to a conclusion as a studio artist, usually is through a lot of experimentation, letting go of any kind of pressure and expectation, and just, pushing yourself to try new things. And that's something that, unfortunately, apart from those kind of really awesome years painting with you, that was something that I didn't do in graffiti a lot. I put a lot of pressure on myself to always be everything had to hit, but you learn from your mistakes. I mean, that's how we learn as a species.
Fantastic. And in the way of failing, learning from your mistakes, or trial and error, experimenting, how do you go about experimenting with new colors and creating interesting color palettes within both your paintings, I think in the studio as well as your graffiti pieces?
Well, Lumit was the first person to teach me about the color wheel. Being the logical human being that he is, the color wheel is still the basis. Understanding contrasting and complementary colors is a really good place to start. And if you've never looked at a color wheel, I mean, you just can take one glance and any intelligent person will understand how it works, and then suddenly it's not even really a thing. For me, the interesting space is not really, and a lot of people say that I'm a good colorist, but for me the interesting space is not really about the color per se, but it's about pushing the limitations of high and low contrast. I've always really enjoyed that space of kind of what's the very least contrast I could put on something in an area and it's impactful, and then have very high contrast in another area in the same piece of work. And that's really been the key to me working with color.
And in terms of future directions for your graffiti, where do you see that going?
I mean, graffiti is something that I've fallen in and out of love with a lot of times in my life, you know. I've just been through a really big out of love with graffiti stage.
You're going through a divorce, separation.
I just been through a phase where it just hasn't been a positive energy in my life. I've been through a phase where it's been a very distracting and very negative thing. You know, I found myself doing some very negative things because I've had a hard time letting go, you know, of that identity that I got myself through doing graffiti for so long, and trying to understand how I can move forward as a human being, but also as a creative human being in life, and be a functional and positive energy. You know, it's been hard, man. It's been harder than people would ever realize. You know, some people know what I've been through. You know, it sort of gets to a point where it's like you live your life in graffiti being at odds with the world 100% of the time. You're always fighting against something. You're always butting heads with people. You know, it's like the thing that makes me so crazy and so angry I can't even explain it. You know, like it's the thing that just will turn me into a despicable human being so quick. You know, and the whole rest of my life right now as an artist and doing mural work, and you know, through, you know, just the kind of consciousness that I'm trying to develop, and through trying to be more involved in activism and causes that I believe in and stuff, I'm such a different person in that world to the person I am in the graffiti world, you know. And every now and then it just kind of rears its ugly head and it makes me feel horrible, you know. Especially like what I touched on earlier, like talking about, you know, like how the scene here, I just don't like even want to be a part of it in the city. You know, like I just want no part of it. I just want to do my own thing, you know what I mean? I'll go to other countries and paint and I feel free and happy and really, you know, but I'm just too emotionally invested in Auckland, you know, and it's like a really bad relationship that just doesn't want to end.
And that's a fantastic lead-in question for opinions and advice for younger writers. So you mentioned that you don't feel the same as you did when you first started graffiti as you do now about it. What still motivates you to do graffiti now? You know, because clearly you have different motivations than when you started.
I guess it's just the familiarity of it, really. It's just something that I know. I mean, I've spent, over half my life doing it. It's something that I know that I'm instinctually good at. And it's a huge part of my identity. It's what most people know me for. But it's, I'm just trying to find that balance, man. I'm just trying to find a balance of where it can still be a positive energy in my life and can be something that leads to good, you know what I mean? And so I'm only doing graffiti when I feel like it. I don't feel compelled. I don't feel that pressure that I used to feel. I used to feel like I was failing as a human being unless I did a certain amount of pieces, like a week or a year, And I would really get so cut when life would get in the way. And I made an absolute priority of this, believe me, you know what I mean? I put it before my own personal health and well-being. I put it before career. I put it before finances. Sadly, I put it before a lot of relationships with loved ones and family. A lot of friendships kind of have suffered. I made a lot of sacrifice to do graffiti. And the funniest thing is, for all that gratification, all the rewards that sort of came through, acknowledgement and respect and everything, the whole rest of my life has kind of been a shambles. And I've had to work a lot of other things out late, especially with this whole art thing, it's kind of there was a point definitely where I really was aspiring to make art and to kind of transition and do that. And like a lot of graffiti writers, that's been a very uncomfortable transition for me. And I've had to there's been a lot of realities I've had to deal with. I would say to people to be very careful about how we all project on social media and stuff. Social media is a curated kind of platform for people to kind of share their successes and their victories, and that seems to be what most people are interested in kind of hearing and seeing. But there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes, and it's not all pretty.
For a lot of younger writers now that haven't been in the game as long as you, aren't aware of all these things, but all they know is what's come before them in terms of styles and techniques and things like that. So graffiti, is essentially evolving quite fast. What advice would you give to the younger generation for them to stay relevant or bring something new to the game?
I just think it's about being honest. I think honesty is kind of missing. I feel like honesty is missing from graffiti because graffiti is sort of inherently about hiding yourself behind a kind of an alter ego, and it's about kind of projecting a desired image of self. I mean, graffiti is almost like what social media is for the majority of kids today, projecting a desired image of self. That's what we were doing before, it was so kind of popular and accessible. That's why it was always surprising when you meet a writer, you meet someone that has a really tough kind of style or a really aggressive style, and they're, a surgeon or a fucking lawyer or something, during the day, or just some, or some real meek, gentle kind of person. It's weird, it's very paradoxical in that sense. But I think my best advice I could give to somebody about how to really kind of get a head start, a positive head start that might kind of set you up for the future, is just about kind of really embracing that honesty and individuality in what you do, knowing what you're about, once again I'd bring it back to Zest. Zest is somebody that I feel like has kind of been an embodiment of his own self and personality, and kind of allowed that to flourish into his fine art work as well, in a way that's not a huge departure from what he does outside on the street, and he's managed to maintain a lot of integrity by just knowing what he's about really early. And we're not all comfortable in our own skin. I know I certainly wasn't, and sometimes I'm still not, so it's learning to be honest has been a very kind of therapeutic part of this kind of later phase in graffiti and art making for me.
I watched an interview with Snoop Dogg actually, and he said all the rappers are sounding the same and rapping a certain style, and he said that in the 90s or early 2000s everybody, not one rapper sounded the same, and I really appreciate that. And he said once you become you, nobody else can become you, and that's when you're the most unique. And I think a lot of the younger generation don't realize that. They kind of see a lot of different genres of graffiti and they just want to emulate it. And likewise, you said you're not that proud of the Auckland scene. I personally wouldn't say I'm not proud of the Auckland scene, but just in terms of where it's kind of heading, I'm not wow, New Zealand has such innovative graffiti to offer to the scene internationally, where I'm just blown away by that, and I don't feel that. In terms of graffiti itself as well, one of the questions is writers are quick to pigeonhole other writers and use labels like sellout, when they do art or paint murals, and just go beyond that traditional graffiti aesthetic. What was that shift like for you when you kind of started going into the fine arts world and started doing portraits, and what were people's reception to that? Do you think they understood it?
I think it was mixed. I mean, I think for the most part, a lot of people, because I was so open about my journey and I was sharing so much with people, on the internet about what I was going through and the thought process behind it, I managed to avoid a lot of the drama. A big trend around the world right now is, and I've just come back from Berlin and from the United States as well, I was in New York and Detroit, is this big backlash to muralism, the big muralism movement. And muralism is kind of it's not a new thing. There's been muralism forever, but as far as this current kind of permutation of it, it's this weird common ground between graffiti, street art, illustrators, designers and fine artists, where they're all working in this kind of new realm, and everybody's really interested about having their work on the street all of a sudden, and that's been the big kind of shift. But unfortunately, the opportunities that have come for us to paint large scale muralism work have been really attached to kind of a lot of this kind of this big focus and kind of redevelopment of kind of, you know, certain areas and gentrification, and for some people it's become a really alienating energy. Like it's become like a thing that like it's a sign that when the murals kind of go up in your kind of lower or working class area, that you're about to get pushed out. And it's really unfortunate, because the thing is that the muralists themselves are all really super idealistic and positive people that kind of, you know, for the most part want to put artwork out there for the enjoyment of people that actually live in those spaces. I mean, not everybody. There's a whole bunch of real egotistical fucking weirdos too, you know, that are doing it for their own reasons. But most part, man, like artists are like super positive people and just stoked for the opportunity, stoked that somebody wants to give them a huge wall and the paint and the lift to do it, and some are even being paid a kind of decent fee. And that, like myself, I've been paid good money, you know, to paint in these type of situations. And for the most part, I believed in the kind of kaupapa behind like some of these scenarios. You know, I've been to, you know, Tahiti, for example. I really believe that the organisers of that festival actually really genuinely, you know, just want, you know, Tahiti to flourish. You know, I've been to some really hard hit places, you know, like Christchurch, or, you know, even like Newcastle in Australia and stuff, you know, where, you know, the motivation of people behind it is just about kind of reinvigorating people's experience in their own space, and it's not about pushing people out at all. But I've also seen that massive transformation of like Wynwood, and I've seen a lot of change in places like Detroit, and obviously New York's pretty like gone pretty far down a certain path, you know. So I see why there's that kind of resentment. As far as selling out, I mean, you know when you're selling out, usually, you know, because if it doesn't feel comfortable and it doesn't feel right, then you're selling out, and that's an arbitrary thing. That's relative to you, you know, to your boundaries and what you feel is selling out. Shit, man, you know, like I said, I could do graffiti in its purest kind of form for the rest of my life, but how am I going to eat? You know, how am I going to pay bills? How am I not going to be a burden on the people around me? Because I've already been there. I did that for 20 years, man. You know, like, you can be the king of graffiti and you can be such a fucking like burden on everybody, like such a complete fucking like, you know, like an anchor in everybody else's life in a bad way. You know, you can drag so many people down with you if you're not like being an adult, you know. You know, if you want to do graffiti for your whole life and be really pure about it, then you better be prepared to kind of be kind of a little bit lonely, you know what I mean? A bit solitary. Be somebody that's happy to be by themselves and not have people around them, you know, that they care about too much, because you got to be, I mean, the best lifestyle for a graffiti writer is pretty much a nomadic one, and it's probably one where you kind of live on the outside of a law, you know, in more than one way, you know what I mean? Or you got to have a complete alter ego, a complete double life. And if you can live like that your whole life, then power to you, man. But I just, you know, I can't create that separation anymore.
In terms of murals, galleries and graffiti, what type of setting do you prefer the most?
It's kind of hard. I mean, I get geeked out about all of them, you know. I enjoy it all, you know. I mean, if I didn't enjoy it all, I wouldn't do it, you know. I hate the pressure of doing a show. I especially hate the pressure and the disappointment of doing a show you really love and believe in and it doesn't sell. And it's not even really about the motivation for money, although the money just enables me to keep making more work. But the gratification, you know. Graffiti was an easy thing to get gratified by, because I would do a piece and put it out there, share my photos with people, and then people would say they liked it or they hated it, you know. And hopefully the majority said they liked it. You know, and then I feel gratified, like, well, that was worth it. You know what I mean?
One question that I'm sure a lot of younger people want to know, actually, which I think is very relevant to now, because this day and age is very different to what graffiti was, you know, 10, 15 years ago. I'm pretty sure what they want to know is it possible to make a living from graffiti?
I don't think it's possible to make a living from graffiti. Like, I think that's a falsehood when people kind of say that. Like, it's possible to make a living from things that are peripheral to graffiti, skills you've learned from graffiti. If you've sort of gone down a path of being a fine artist. Sure, you could potentially make a living if you became a graphic designer or an illustrator. If you paint commercial murals for people, even in a graffiti style, sure, you can make money from that. Making money from graffiti, like, think about that. Like, the act of graffiti is not really conducive to kind of making an income. You know, it's a completely different motivation. It's a completely different thing. Graffiti is a lifestyle. So when you're doing it, it's like you give everything to it, and everything else that you do is just to support that. It's not to make money from, you know. Like, if you're racking and selling stuff to kids, you know, so that you can go and paint graffiti, you know, you're not making money from graffiti. You know, if you paint a canvas and make money from that so you can go paint graffiti, you're not making money from graffiti. If you go work a regular day job, you're clearly not making money from graffiti, but you're doing the graffiti. So that's the big paradox. When people say you can make a living from it, no, you can't make a living from it. Quite the opposite, in my opinion.
So I guess after almost 20 years of writing now, you know, which is over 20 years, definitely old school, do you consider yourself as, you know, like a successful writer or a creative? Because that's one of the questions that, you know, one of the people have asked, and I think everybody's just going to have a different definition of what success is, you know. So would you consider yourself a successful creative or writer?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, successful in the sense that I do it every day. Successful in that I get a lot of opportunity and a platform to do it, and there's people that like it and support me in doing it. I've always had the massive hurdle, man, which is just that I live out here. You know, that's been very hard for me. I've had to work twice as hard to be seen. I've had to work twice as hard to sell, you know, and support myself, you know what I mean? It's always been an uphill battle. It always will be an uphill battle as long as I live here. Like, I know that, you know what I mean? Like, do I own a house? No. Will I ever own a house? Quite possibly not. You know, do I have debt? Yes. What else? I mean, you know, shit, it's not like I'm like rolling in the money, you know what I mean? I live just my means. Sometimes I live just a little bit beyond my means, and I'm playing catch up. You know, it's real life. You know what I mean? It's like, the bigger the project I work on, you know, the larger investment of my energy where I'm not making money in the meantime until I do the project. And so that's a long storm to weather sometimes. If I'm painting for a show, you know, there might be 2-3 months that I'm painting every day and I'm spending money making work, and I'm not even guaranteed a sale at the end of the day. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think people have to be very careful about the perceived glamour of this life. You know, it's not all perfect. It's not all peachy, you know what I mean? It's like a lot of it is very tough. You know, I would be much more financially stable working a job that I hate. Or maybe a job that I'm indifferent about. Maybe even a job I like slightly, you know, but maybe I wouldn't be fulfilling something very important in myself that I feel like I need to do. You know? And I guess that's the kind of decision I made, is to kind of go down this path and put all my eggs in one basket, you know, so to speak. But I don't know, man. It's tough, bro. It is tough.
Could you tell us an exciting story or a mission about one of your adventures in America?
I have too many of those, and none of them are short enough, like, to tell within this time frame. So yes, I've had a lot of adventures. I've had a lot of amazing adventures. I've had some things that, like, I can't even, you know, I don't know what would be one of the best ones. Shit, I can't even say, man. I'm sorry, bro.
Last question would be, what final parting words of advice would you have for any kind of up-and-coming writers, whether it be in New Zealand or international, based on all the experiences you've learned or you've had, and all the mistakes you've made, all the positive things that have come your way from your journey in writing? What final words would you like to part, which has the potential really to influence these guys when they listen to this interview and watch the video?
It really just comes back to what I said earlier about honesty, and also understanding where you come from. You know, once upon a time there used to be very regional graffiti, like literally to, like, you know, the point where there were distinctions between different parts of, like, the same city. You know, in Auckland you could see a difference between an east side rider and a west side rider. You know, you could tell the difference between someone that came from south, someone came from the city, or from the shore. Like, there were distinctions. I mean, they're still kind of there a little bit, you know. But there was definitely huge distinctions between people that came from different parts of the world, you know. I mean, when you think about what is a Midwest style in America, you know, versus a West Coast style, you know, versus a classic New York style, you know, they're hugely different. You think about what UK graffiti looked like, what German graffiti looked like, what German graffiti from different places looked like, what graffiti from Paris looked like. Like, it used to be so much more defined, you know. And I think there's a beauty in that. I think we have to get back to that. I think we have to understand the power of place. You know, that's what gives it context. Like, graffiti is this big homogenous kind of thing where everyone's following the same trend and so on trend at the same time. It's detrimental to its kind of character and development. It's become less human. It's become less of a celebration of humanity. Graffiti is, when it's done really well and pure, it's kind of a celebration, you know. It's kind of just a raw expression of youth and energy. And what's better than being able to look at something and be like, wow, you know, that's Chinese graffiti, you know, that's Thai graffiti, you know, that's Malaysian graffiti, you know, that's Australian graffiti, that's like very specific Sydney graffiti from Australia, you know. Like, I reckon people need to get back to that, tap into what makes your place important and different, and roll with it.
Thank you very much, bro, for your insights in terms of graffiti, writing, your background, your process, everything. And yeah, thanks to everybody for watching and listening, and stay tuned for episode 3. Once again, we will put out some questions out there in terms of who you guys want as the next person. Episode 2 was my preference. But yeah, we want to, you know, in terms of my vision itself for what the real-time video series kind of offers for you guys, is that it gives you guys an insight in terms of what writers that have been in the game for a long time or a very short time are thinking in terms of their perspective, and also, you know, what their working process is in terms of painting their graffiti. So stay tuned for the next episode.
Askew naked. It's the title of the video.
Oh god. I can imagine.